So good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us in this seminar. My name is Chandre Gould. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Security Studies, Justice and Violence Prevention Program. The title of this seminar is Addressing Hunger in South Africa, Now and in the Future. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the seminar and to welcome our speakers. Henrietta Abrams, Chairperson of the Bonte-Yeoville Development Forum, Suveer Ramdhani from the Gauteng Food Security Committee, amongst many other things, Nonhlanhla Joy, representing small-scale farmers from Umgibe Farming Organics, and Tatjana von Bormann from the World Wildlife Foundation. You're going to hear a little more about each of these presenters in a few minutes when I hand over to my co-host from Rios, Rebecca Freeth. But before we get into the substance, a few housekeeping issues. We're a very large group, so please keep your microphones muted until we get into the small group discussions a little later on. If you move your mouse over the Zoom screen, for those of you who are not dialing in, by phone, you'll see a toolbar at the bottom. And if you click on participants, you'll be able to see everybody who's here. If you also click on the chat function, you'll be able to send messages to the group or to individuals while the meeting's taking place. And we're going to use that later on to gather input from the small groups. Now, we've taken a number of precautions to avoid the possibility of being Zoom bombed. Our technical team, Richard and TJ, are going to be monitoring the chat box, and they'll remove anyone who is abusive, racist, or rude. And those people will not be able to return. The same is true for anyone who unmutes themselves to make abusive comments. We hope that we can conduct this meeting with respect and with compassion. So most of you have your videos off right now. And we'd ask that those of you who have enough bandwidth, just put your videos on for a while and keep them on while the speakers are speaking, because that way the speakers can see and read their audience. So please turn your videos on now, just for a moment, if you can, so that we can briefly see who's in our virtual room. You'll be able to scroll through the pages and silently greet one another with your eyes. We have a wonderful, diverse online audience representing several African countries. We have Côte d'Ivoire, Kenya, Lesotho, Mauritania, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. We also have participants from Canada, the United States, India, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Norway. You're all very welcome. We have government officials, diplomats, NGOs, academics, business people, and international organizations. Thank you so much for joining us. Those of you who need to can now turn your videos off. Thanks. So while we're all dealing with many challenges right now, none are as pressing as hunger. Air, water, food, and shelter are the most basic needs for all humans. And when these needs are not met, the result is catastrophic for the person affected, for their immediate family, for their community, and for society. And food insecurity and violence are very close companions, and it's easy to see the connection, as we did a few weeks ago in South Africa when food parcels became a feature of our new landscape. What we saw is how hunger, uncertainty, fear, and our citizens' very strong sense of what is fair and what is not, built on a legacy of unfairness, interacted in a toxic mix. And that was an important lesson. But it may hide the longer-term relationship between hunger, violence, inequality, and poverty. Over 200 million children in low and middle income countries do not achieve their developmental potential because of the effects of poverty and hunger. And in South Africa, 20% of children under the age of 5 are stunted because they don't get enough nutritious food. And not having enough to eat affects children's cognitive development, their health, and their social and emotional development. And these factors combine to entrench poverty and inequality intergenerationally. Having enough nutrition is critical to educational achievement and ultimately also to success in the job market. And failing to ensure that all South Africans have enough nutritious food has had and will continue to have devastating consequences for our development as a nation. The Institute for Security Studies has long played a role in continental discussions about food security as a key condition for human security. But until now, the primary focus of the Justice and Violence Prevention Program, where I work, has been on supporting and strengthening evidence-led violence prevention, strengthening the criminal justice system, and promoting a good understanding of crime and violence in our country. The coronavirus has forced us into a new awareness about the silos we may have worked in. Can no longer separate out the need to address hunger from the need for safety and security. They're mutually dependent, and they represent a complex cluster of social problems that we have a unique opportunity to address now, although the problems themselves are very far from new. Now, this is not the first seminar on hunger and food security in South Africa during the crisis caused by the coronavirus. It won't be the last either. But we intend for this seminar to build on the discussions that have gone before, growing the conversation that others have started to deepen our knowledge of what needs to be done to ensure that South Africans do not remain hungry in the face of plenty. And we hope this will create new connections and spur action. I'd like to share a few observations from seminars and conversations over the past few weeks about hunger and food security. They focused on several key issues. The one is the increasing cost of basic foods. Food prices have gone up. There's also the significant shortfall between the value of social grants and the amount of money a household needs to feed itself. According to the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group, and Mervyn Abrams is unfortunately not able to join us this afternoon, the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group has tracked the cost of a basket of 38 basic foodstuffs over time. A basket of food for a family for a month is valued at around 3,470 Rand. And that's more than the value of any of the current social grants. And what this means in effect is that even before this crisis, families not earning a minimum wage, and even those just earning a minimum wage, were going hungry at least 1 and often 2 weeks of every month. There's also a pressing need to enable and support informality in the provision and distribution of food. Many different support systems and services are needed, and sources of support, from school feeding programs to community soup kitchens, to address the shortfall between income and household food needs. We may just have to live with the fact that we can't track all of these and coordinate them perfectly. And then there's the issue of the increased risk that small-scale farmers are having to face to their operations as a result of the closure of supply chains. Now, some may never recover from this, and others will do so with difficulty, representing a massive loss to the food system. On the other hand, there are opportunities that are now presenting themselves. This crisis is forcing NGOs, charitable organizations, government, community-based organizations, and others to move very much faster and to make changes like rethinking food supply chains and learning to work more closely with each other. There also seems to be an increased social listening by state and large actors and a deeper awareness of the dependency of government on social intermediaries to complement state action. And then there's the greatly improved ability for the government to communicate quickly and accurately and without bias using private sector networks, including corporations, social media, traditional media, and other technology. So it's our hope that we can use this time of crisis to address long-standing complex social problems that have led us to partner with RIOS in hosting this webinar, and we're very grateful to the Hans Seidel Foundation for their support that has enabled us to meet in this way today. I'd like to hand over now to my co-host, Rebecca Freeth, to introduce herself and introduce our speakers. Rebecca.
Thank you, Chandre, and wonderful to see you all here. Over the past 10 years of being closely involved with the Southern Africa Food Lab, RIOS has learned a lot about the food system. The work of the Food Lab is to promote creative responses to the problem of hunger through multi-stakeholder dialogue and action. The RIOS is hosting this webinar with ISS because we're committed to dialogue that spans multiple and often conflicting perspectives and experiences. In the past, and now in this time of COVID, we often find ourselves in separate and parallel conversations about the food system and hunger. There's great risk that we talk past each other and fail to really listen, especially to the voices of those most directly affected. And so we've designed these 90 minutes to maximize our exposure to multiple perspectives and experiences. And we'll do that by listening to 4 different speakers, each of whom will speak for 5 minutes. You'll then find yourself in a breakout group with 2 other people where there's a chance to talk about what you've heard and to surface your questions and your insights, and then to identify one of those, which the scribe of your group, if you identify one scribe, will then put into the chat box. Those questions and insights will form the basis for the ensuing discussion with our panelists, who I now have great pleasure in introducing in a bit more detail. So first we have Henrietta Abrams. Henrietta's joining us on dial-in, so you won't get to see her face, but she's a community activist and she's chairperson of the Bonteheuwel Development Forum. The forum was established in 2018 after the total shutdown on gangsterism, drugs and crime. Since then, the forum has been organizing at block and street level where committees focus on bread and butter issues such as housing, food and hunger, and gender-based violence. Henrietta will be followed by Suveer Ramdhani, who's project coordinator of the Gauteng Food Security Committee. He's also a voluntary leader in Linked To, which is a South African digital solution in the food relief response. In his day job, Suveer is Chief Strategy Officer at CCOM. Next, we'll be able to listen to Nonhlanhla Joye, who's CEO of Umgibe Farming Organics. Nonhlanhla is famous as the woman who planted a farm in a plastic bag and then set up Umgibe, which supports over 1,200 small-scale organic farmers, most of whom are women. Nonhlanhla serves on the advisory board of the Southern Africa Food Lab and is speaking to us from Durban. And lastly, we'll hear from Tatjana von Bormann, who's been a pioneer of the Food Lab and is currently its chair. In her day job, she's head of the Policy and Futures Unit at WWF, where she has expertise in, among many other things, identifying points of leverage for large-scale food system change. Each of the speakers will set the scene of their work in response to issues of hunger under COVID. They'll identify something that's working well in their work and identify a key challenge. So Henrietta, if we can start with you, please. You have direct experience on the ground working at a community level, providing meals to people who are hungry, and we'd very much like to hear about your experiences. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. We have been, since before the lockdown, we have been busy in our area and adjacent areas. So when the president announced lockdown to start, or before lockdown, we decided in our community we're going to prepare our vulnerable residents in our community for lockdown. So we jumped out at mid-March already, doing awareness work, getting hygiene packs to our elderly and our sick, our aged and our disabled, going around in our streets and our blocks explaining what the virus is and how we are vulnerable to it. But now we must also remember that on the 27th of March, our social grants did not pay out yet. So we had a number of people that were in need of food going into lockdown. So we as a community-based organization beforehand already drew up in our street committees, we drew up a database as to who are most vulnerable in our streets and on our streets and in our blocks are. So we tended to service the needs of those vulnerable people. We then got together food parcels and we worked via our database. So our street committee members, street committee coordinators, and our block coordinators would know these food parcels should be going to these households. Now, people must also understand that we are a working class area, and we are an overpopulated working class area with a lot of unemployed people and a lot of people that is dependent on government grants. So, for instance, we would have a family living in a 230 square meters plot, and they could easily be like 17, 21, and in one household we even have 52 members, with most of the members being children. So one can only imagine the hunger that we have in such houses, because there's high unemployment, and if there are the few people that is working within that household would be working low-paid, low-level jobs. So what they're getting prior to, or what they got prior to COVID-19 lockdown was not even sufficient to carry them through. With them now not being able to move around and to hustle for something to eat over the pot or so forth, we had to step in as a community and to help and assist our people. So we've been doing knock and drop off at our elderly for the past, I think we're in our 12th week now. And then we found that the food parcels in itself was not sufficient, because we couldn't reach as many people as we wanted to. We must also understand that we, as the Development Forum, we went out and collected funds. We did fundraising amongst friends, residents, everybody that could give us and assist us. We asked for everybody's help. So we did not get any help from government or big NGOs out there that's in distributing food. We must also remember that time government and big NGOs were still getting their supply chains and everything and the warehousing together. So we as communities had to jump out and assist our poor and vulnerable residents. So after about 5 weeks of handing out food parcels, we decided this is not working, because the need is getting so much greater, because so many more people, those who were luckily employed, then got retrenched. So the need got better. So we also went in the month of Ramadan, where the Muslims, a big part of our community is the Muslim community, went into fasting, the month of fasting. And then we saw much more people in our lines asking for food parcels to at least have something to eat during the month of Ramadan for breaking fast. And that is where we decided we're going to move from the food parcels to feeding schemes. So we are organized in 17 blocks, right? The 17 little neighborhoods within our area, and each neighborhood has got 2 feeding schemes, which we supply with food provisions. So the way we operate is that we go towards the elderly, the disabled and so forth, and we knock and drop, and then the young and will come out and we feed them. So at one point, we are feeding between 250 and 300 persons. So right now, as we're sitting here today, we are feeding between 45,000 and 50,000 people on a weekly basis in our area. This is a lot that we have to do, considering that we are fundraising for ourselves. Our queues are getting longer and longer and longer, the longer we're getting under under lockdown. So food security is a definite issue for us. The feeding schemes, the food parcels is not working for us. The feeding schemes is not working for us as we wanted it to. So we know that there's something drastic needs to happen. We have been having issues with, because we're buying on a weekly basis, we've been having issues with food increases. There's been, at times, there were scarcities of rice, of maize meal, of sugar. There's been steep price increases in terms of rice, sugar, lentils, beans, and all of these staple foods. So what we have done as the Bonteheuwel community, because we work with our other communities on the Cape Flats also, we came together, for instance, with Heideveld, which is adjacent to us, and Nicholsprint, and we said, right, guys, food is too expensive. We as communities are paying the normal price as any Jones soap in the street. So let's come together and buy in bulk and get some reduced prices. So we had to kind of work amongst ourselves. How do we get more food for less money so that we can get more people fed out there? So one of the issues and the challenges for us is that the price of food is becoming too expensive for our poor, as has been mentioned before. So if we are struggling in our urban areas, how much more are our residents in our rural areas and peri-urban areas still not struggling, where food tends to be more expensive? We need to look at the food system. We need to look at the way food is sold. We need to look at the high profit margins that your agents and your retailers are taking. And we, during this crisis, during this global crisis of hunger, how do we reduce food, and how do we cut out the middlemen, and how do we bring the retailers in line and say what you guys are doing is literally not on. You cannot be making your high profits at the expense of lives, poor people's lives on the ground. So our next move for us is we're talking about food gardens, we're talking about food forests. How do we move towards food security for our poor? So as the forum, we are in talks with our SGBs, our school governing bodies. We are in talks with, we plan to talk with the Department of Agriculture in terms of their food security program. We need to have food gardens in all our public spaces. Instead of building trees for shade, we need to be growing fruit trees. Our people cannot afford fruit. We cannot afford to buy an apple or an orange because the opportunity cost is too high. I'd rather save that 20 rand to buy electricity than having to buy an apple or a few bananas for my kids at home. So we have to work with a public-private partnership in terms of building or growing food on our schools, in our parks, on our fields, in our streets, for instance. So we have planned, for instance, that in our block, in the 17 blocks, we will be planting fruit trees. So this block will have guavas and apples, and a winter fruit and a summer fruit, and the next block would have something else. So on the way to school, on the way to work, our people are able to pick whatever fruit and exchange fruits, as they are saying, growing different fruits in the different blocks. In terms
Thank you,
of the
Henriette.
food garden,
sorry to come in here, but that sounds like a great note to hand over to Suveer on. Would that be all right? Thanks. So you've heard from Henriette. Henrietta, next we're going to go to you, Suveer. You're sitting at the other end of the spectrum of food provision, working at a province-wide scale, high-tech coordination of food parcel delivery. Could you share some of those experiences with us, please?
Thank you, Rebecca. I must confess that we're aspiring towards high-tech, not always there all of the time. And similar to my colleague who just spoke, this is a very basic problem, and sometimes the human connection needs to flow first. So just a bit of an introduction to everyone on the call. The Gauteng Food Security Committee evolved out of 30 or 40 of our religious civil society leaders and business leaders coming together, recognizing the nature and scale. I think the scale of the crisis was the thing that scared us the most. And we decided to put together this committee as a form of an intervention. And we took a very corporate style project office approach to the work that we're doing. So we got corporate volunteers. I guess many of us have time on our hands and not anymore. And we came together as a group and we decided to design an approach to solve this. And our approach has changed over the last 8 weeks. As we saw the Katrada Foundation launch the Gauteng Together initiative, we backed off from perhaps more civilian approaches. We saw the Nelson Mandela Foundation raise cash and money and food from local stores. So we backed off from those efforts. And where we found ourselves was doing, I guess, what people like me are really good at is a lot of paperwork, raising large donor funds on the one end. It comes into this corporate engine in the middle where we run large scale procurement, and that addresses, the previous concern that was raised about trying to get the cost of food down, which is not an easy task. We then put it into large warehouses and then large distribution efforts through corporate sponsors. But this is where we're not good, and this is where we back off. We partner with a church in a local community. We partner with a temple or a synagogue for that matter, and we distribute downstream through community-based organizations. And there's a number of reasons for that, not only because we're not particularly good at it as corporate types, but also because you really need a very personal understanding of what goes on within these communities in order to be effective. And that's where I can perhaps segue into some of the other issues that we'd like to speak about. And that is, despite everything we're doing, I know that what we're doing is not good enough, and it's not enough. And so the approach that we've taken is what little we have, we spread it as far as possible so that the most vulnerable find some means of being, finding food. The only way to do that, if someone in that community can determine who is most vulnerable, and then make peace with those that are not receiving aid. And so that's, I'm not sure if that approach is the right approach. It's just that we're left with what minimal resources we have to do the best that we can. Now, to give you a scale of the problem, we heard this from the Gauteng Department of Social Development. They typically service 280,000 indigent people in our province on a monthly basis. That stepped up to 4.5 million in the wake of this crisis. So we've got a social department approach on the one hand, and you've got humanitarian relief on the other. On the one hand, it's people that have an ID card, that fill in forms, that queue up, they have a date, and they get welfare. On the other hand, imagine in the worst of situations, and just to be somewhat dramatic, a truck, an 18-wheeler truck with maize, and it's just being chucked off the back. And what happens in both of those situations is on the one hand, with all the forms and the paperwork, you can't scale. And on the other extreme, it's absolute chaos because the women, the children, the elderly don't get access to the relief that's coming in on the back of these trucks. And it creates all forms of other crises within these environments. So we're trying to find a middle ground here. And if I had to be honest, we're not getting there just yet, but we're learning as we go along. So very quickly, then moving on with the last minute that I have. So we find that the relief is working in some areas and flaring up in other areas. So at this point, we can't say that the crisis is getting worse. It's just shifting around the province. So initially, it was in the heart of Gauteng. Now we find it in the far north and in the far south. We're finding that it's shifting from South Africans to undocumented immigrants. And we're then beginning to find that the logistics is quite complex and that different solutions are emerging. Some people are saying, you can't be doing the hampers, you've got to do digital vouchers. Other people are saying that the hampers are not nutritionally adequate, it doesn't have fresh food in it. When you do fresh food, it tends to get rotten. So there's all different types of solutions out there. And in my last few seconds, the only thing that I can say is we've decided not to select a particular approach, but because we can't meet the total meal requirement, everyone is welcome to do what the best they can, you know. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Suveer. And Nonhlanhla, we come to you next to hear more about how lockdown's affecting small-scale farmers operating particularly in the informal food economy, and what's happening to your produce at the moment. Over to you.
Hey everyone. The first 2 weeks have became very difficult for us because with the lockdown, it meant that whoever we were supplying as small-scale farmers, we didn't have anyone to supply. So we lost a lot of money. We lost a lot of food, and some of it we donated it, but even the movement was limited. So a lot of learnings happened there. And after 2 weeks of the same thing, we finally approached somebody who linked us with Food Flow, an organization that helps small-scale farmers to buy from them so that it can be given to charities. And that is how I got all these farmers that we are working with to actually make money, even though it was less than what we normally would get, but it was better than having our food rotting away. The lockdown had a very big negative impact on small-scale farmers who are already struggling with the markets, access to markets and everything. But I wouldn't say that it was all doom and gloom, because after 2 weeks, when we started with this organization, we were able to sell more produce and at the same time be able to connect with charities that are feeding people fresh and nutritious vegetables. And we are feeding plus minus 600 people a week do in an every day situation. So as much as there is negativity on this, this is not the beginning of what is happening. It's been happening. It's just that the COVID-19 actually exposed how fragile our food system is in South Africa. So I think what we need to do is to ask ourselves, what lessons are we learning from this? How we can prevent a similar thing happening outside. As I'm speaking in my home, I've got kids lining up to be fed because they are not at school where they normally get their one pocket. They see some smoke, they come with their dishes to be dished up. Sometimes I'm just doing something else. I'm not cooking. So there needs to be something that we can come up with. And I'm hoping that as we are here participating, we can come up with solutions. I thank you.
Thank you, Nonhlanhla. And lastly, Tatjana, we come to you. Perhaps you can help us zoom out a bit and get a handle on some of the big picture issues of hunger in the food system at the moment.
Thanks, Rebecca. And yes, I mean, the big picture issues sort of, it really does start with where Chandre left off, and as Suveer said, and Henrietta, the need is so outpacing relief at the moment. And I think those of us who've worked in the food system have seen signs of strain and have almost been dreaming of a disruption, that in order to start putting the pieces back together in a way that made sense. But I think nobody could have predicted a disruption on this scale. And I would think, like others have been saying, the first part of this has been really a trying to adjust to the new ways of working and to understanding how best placed your organization is to provide the kind of immediate support, and at the same time be thinking about how you work in this new system in order to build better, stronger, more resilient systems going forward. So I'll bounce around a bit, maybe speaking a bit to the work of WWF, but I also want to draw some of the work of the Southern African Food Lab into this discussion, because I think that as South Africa, and probably Africa's longest running multi-stakeholder dialogue platform, has been both quite challenged in this space and been rapidly adapting to understand the role of multi-stakeholder engagement in this time and in a time of social distancing. So perhaps it's for WWF, I think potentially our most important role to date has been redirecting existing funding and looking at discretionary sources of funding that we have, or large partners that we're able to work with to ensure that money flows to immediate relief efforts. And I think that in itself has been a really busy and intense process, but one that immediately feels like it plays an enabling role that is useful. The other role for us has been in a sort of steady strategic campaign around radio, TV, digital, webinars, sharing COVID-related tools, and participating in multi-stakeholder platforms, which brings me into the Food Lab work, which, as I say, it's a dialogue platform. It's very much based on bringing people into a space to work through challenging issues, to engage in a way that brings resolution, or at least innovation in ways of engaging. So having to shift into a virtual process has been one where I think issues of listening have been brought to the fore, and looking at how we design and facilitate things where you're able, in a much less immediate environment, to create those ways of listening. And I would say perhaps a success in that space is the policy roundtables we're co-designing with Landness, and in partnership with government, and specifically the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, where on a really challenging issue around agrarian and land reform, we are able to design inclusive processes that enable us to listen to each other and learn from each other in a digital platform, and really make sure that you know, because digital environments can be exclusionary. You need data, you need a stable connection, and those challenges, ensuring that key stakeholders have their perspective heard, have been a challenge. But, and in fact, this is something that Chandre is participating in a different space. We've been starting to look at how you take dialogue into action. So dialogue processes tend to be around how we bring the the conversations into the room and allow things to take shape from that point. Whereas what we're doing now in KZN is looking at where we actually have funding for projects on the ground and designing dialogue processes around place-based actions and activities. And I think that is, for us, developing a new model that we will certainly take forward into the next phase of the work of the lab. How we take advantage of this crisis is really around paying attention to the role that non-state actors have played in food relief, and looking at how we develop integrated mechanisms for engaging government, for creating state mechanisms that really work for everyone, allowing the voice of people who actively work in the food system to play a role in policy making, to avoid the kind of situations we've seen, sorry, I think that might be my 5 minutes, where government is making policies that do not support the people on the ground. Because really fundamental here is the need not just to go back to the way we were doing things, but to really understand how this has come about as a result of our failure to protect nature first and foremost, but then to protect one another within the food system as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much to our speakers who stuck so well to time. It's very hard to speak for 5 minutes. So thank you. You will have an opportunity later on in the course of the seminar to perhaps make additions to what you said so far. But I think what we've seen, certainly what I've heard, is quite a lot about what's working well. And one of those things is the very quick learning that organizations and individuals are undergoing that is leading to a flexibility that we don't normally see in systems, in organizations, in individuals' ways of acting to address the crisis. And we're seeing innovation. Everything from group buying by community organizations to figuring out how to navigate the distribution of food when we have donations in really vast quantities, which is what Suveer was talking about. And now to hear how to go from dialogue to action and to ensure that the small-scale farmers who are really struggling are not left out of this process. I think we also have seen how local organization at street level can enable communities to overcome crises and increases resilience and enables the development of sustainable solutions. I think what was most interesting in the interchange between Henrietta and Suveer was to see how important it is for huge distribution networks like those that Suveer is managing to have a strong base in communities who know who the vulnerable families are and can get food to them. So I think there's a strong link across these different parts of the system that we're seeing is necessary and are beginning to be activated. We also have seen how quickly food can be distributed and collected and how quickly funds can be raised during this time. And I guess that comes to what Tatjana has been saying, is how do we make sure, and Untitled as well, how do we make sure that the lessons that we're learning now are things that we can take into the future? Rebecca, I think you've been watching for some of the challenges.
Yeah, so I'm hearing challenges particularly around scale, the sheer size of the issue, whether you're looking at a local level, as Henrietta is, and looking at households that are crowded with up to 52 people in a house, or whether you're looking across a province and seeing the scale, it's pretty overwhelming. I guess an added complication is, as you were saying, Suveer, that the problem is shifting geographically, so it's very difficult to create a solution or to address the issue in a sustainable way when it changes character. And Nonhlanhla, you've been talking about children queuing outside your home. And so, you know, this question of scale and need and not knowing when things will shift again. And just, I guess, several of you have mentioned that this is not a new problem. This is a long-lasting problem, and it's being exposed. And so therein, what I was hearing was the opportunity that some of the optimists on this panel are tuned into, about this moment for disruption, for rethinking, for listening differently, for acting differently. And yeah, and so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
So I think that brings us very nicely to the opportunity for learning and doing things differently. Now, normally in seminars like this, where we have very many people online, we don't normally have very much interaction outside the chat function and perhaps one or two questions. So we're trying something different today in this seminar, and that is that in the next few minutes, we're going to be breaking you into some groups to further this discussion, because I'm quite sure that, having heard the questions and challenges and imperatives shared by the speakers, and given the fact that you no doubt here because you have a concern or a question or are part of the solution, we're going to give you a chance to air those. So when you get into your small groups, that will be groups of 3, randomly selected. You don't know who you're going to end up with, and therein lies the beauty, because I think you might very well find yourself meeting someone you didn't expect to, and sharing thoughts with someone who might very well have different or the same ideas as you. So when you get into your small group, the task is to briefly introduce yourself, of course, by your name and organization, and then agree on who would take some very basic notes. We're not looking for long, detailed reports or anything like that. Then discuss your key insights or questions arising from the inputs and from your own experience. In your group, you'll get a 1-minute alert, and please then identify one issue to share from your discussion, which your scribe will write into the chat box when you return to plenary. Please don't write in the chat box in your breakout window, because then no one else will see it. We'll do that when we get back. Thank you for being part of this experiment to try what happens when we break people into random groups and have a conversation. And I'm looking forward to hearing what your insights are. So I see that one of the issues is the challenges expressed by speakers, and there seems to be a strong inclination that gardens in homes is the way forward. There was a question from one of the groups to the panelists, and I'd encourage the panelists to maybe keep note of this. What are your views on the debate about cash grants versus food parcels to relieve hunger? So speakers, we'll ask you to respond to that in a few moments. There's a question from breakout room 7. We'd like to raise the issue of support for foreign nationals in South Africa and concerns around xenophobia and its effect on accessing relief. So I think that's a question that perhaps Suveer can speak to, because you raised it, and maybe also Tatjana. That seems to be a concern from Suveer's room as well, and it appears that the foreign refugee camps across the continent have been neglected. Another comment is we'll need to have 2 food systems in the future. One that's a formal system, similar to our previous systems, but a second being a social support system where society as a whole can ensure support for all to ensure the realization of the right for food for all. Here's a question. How do we ensure that conversations like this include stakeholders like those who are experiencing food insecurity on the ground, and who can offer insight into what will actually help them? And I think that's why Nhlanhla and Henrietta are with us today, because they are very much those people who are experiencing it firsthand. So we're really glad that they have been able to join us. I don't know if there are other comments that anyone would like to pop in, or perhaps if not, at this stage we can invite our, there we go. This is a comment from Francis Davies. We need value chain compression. I wish I knew what that meant. And I'm hoping that one of our speakers is cleverer than I am. And there seem to be many cases of intimidation from local councillors against small organizations involved in food distribution or assistance with establishing food gardens. It seems as if some councillors are concerned that they may have to compete with those who are providing food and assistance to particularly rural people. It may also be that these organizations are picking up cases of food and other goods being irregularly distributed by councillors. A case where rural women are currently trying to get an interdict against some councillors. So the involvement of local politicians in food distribution seems to be something that arose early on in the crisis and is not abating. There have been statements by some politicians that politicians should not be involved in the distribution of food. But in other cases, I think local councillors have been playing a positive role ensuring that goods get to soup kitchens. I'd love to hear what our speakers have to say. From Paula Malloy and those in her group, given that the demand greatly outstrips supply, how do we minimize the risk of conflict when undertaking food distribution? Excuse me. And how do we link food distribution to other vital services like water and sanitation? There's an appetite for recommendations. Rebecca.
Yes, as somebody mentions water, I wondered if you wanted some water. Okay, so the questions will probably keep coming in, but maybe we just pause there for a moment on this question of a recommendation paper. And Nonhlanhla, can we direct the first question to you? In fact, this question of gardens and homes. What are your thoughts on the potential and the feasibility of having a garden in every home?
For me, that would be a dream come true, because COVID-19 actually exposed how much food insecure we are in Africa, not just South Africa, but the idea of one home, one garden is the only solution that I can see working, because the cost of food, especially the vegetables, is very high. And if everyone could be able to grow their own food, that would be the first step towards securing making sure that we are a food secure country. So I'm all for that. How do we go about that? We need to sit down in our communities, see how we use interventions like what we talked about earlier on, the Seedpreneurs program, where we create value chains locally that are going to make sure that they cover everything in our communities, from seed to the table. Thank you.
Could you say a sentence or two, Nonhlanhla, about your work with school children and growing seeds?
We've got a Seedpreneurs program that teaches kids from 7 years old to produce seedlings in schools, and that in turn 20% of that the kids grow vegetables at home. And each seedpreneur has got a vegetable at home. So each seedpreneur, one home garden. And if we can teach them young, they'll be able to be responsible, what we call citizens who can feed themselves, because we are becoming a state that is dependent on everyone else. And we don't want to teach our kids that. Thank you.
And maybe that takes us on to the next question very beautifully, Nonhlanhla, about this, the question about cash grants versus food parcels. And I think to that, I would add the question of soup kitchens. So you've got these three options, and maybe we start with you, Henrietta, and then pass it over to you, Suveer, for both of your perspectives.
Hi, thank you. I'm unmuted. Okay, for me, we need to address what we aren't addressing here today is food, power, and politics. And from a community perspective, it's who holds the food holds the power. So somebody's previous question in terms of politicians handing out food and food parcels, it's very important that we as communities take back our power. So we need to go back to building food security for ourselves on our doorsteps and in our public spaces. In terms of what Nonhlanhla mentioned earlier on, or the question raised earlier on, in terms of every home must have a food garden. In all homes, it is not possible, because we must consider also in rural areas we have the space, we might have the space, or when people are living in informal settlements, there aren't space. We have so many backyard dwellers, so if we're going to talk about food gardens at home, we need to look at what is the feasibility and how do we look at vertical gardens and the supply of those things. So we need to come up with adequate solutions when we talk food gardens, and we need to take into consideration land and spatial planning. In terms of vouchers or cash instead of food parcels, what has worked for us, so if we're in the feeding schemes, and I think, unfortunately, I was muted in the chat, there was a discussion of what works best, what should be the combinations that we need to find solutions for. So for me, it would be a combination of things. So you have the Food Flow, for instance, and SA Harvest and all of these other organizations. And everybody cannot deliver consistently as humanitarian relief organizations. So we need to look at a multi-pronged approach, which vouchers or cash is one part of the solution. Because for me, having to work with 34 feeding schemes, we are working with cash, we are working with donations in kind, we are working with vouchers that we're getting as donations. So for instance, if we get a 1,000 Rand voucher, which we are getting currently from the DG Murray Trust for the next 3 weeks, we buy things such as jik and liquid soap and scourers, stuff for the kitchen because it's little. So yes, in terms of the household, how many of them are going to use it for actual food purposes? But for a feeding scheme, it makes perfect sense to have a combination of humanitarian assistance when it comes to food. I'll leave it there for now. Oh, the food value chains I wanted to talk about. There was a question about that. I want to bring it home, drill it down. The value chains, food value chains that we are talking about would be commercial value chains. But we need to really start in our communities having the fruit and vegetable fresh produce markets. So we grow our own food in our public spaces, take it to our CBDs in our local areas, and then also have the supply chain there. So we have community gardens. We hand over freely to the feeding schemes on the schools and in our neighborhoods. And if we, for instance, grow mushrooms or corn or whatever it is, those things we can sell at the market. So those are some of my suggestions. Thank you.
Thanks, Henrietta. Suveer, what are your thoughts about vouchers, soup kitchens, and food parcels?
Yes, look, I think, let me start off with a little bit about pricing of food. So, you know, we as a committee work under the good governance of Nick Benadell and Rolf Meyer and Tanya Cohen. And, you know, we have to be very, very accountable about the way that we spend our money, and we're audited and those sorts of things. So, you know, very quickly we learned one of the skills that we had from the corporate space that we brought into our committee was kind of the RFP process, or the tender process. And we adapted it. And I'm sharing this because it could be benefit to everyone. We initially started off with kind of a 3 quotes approach, and we got to, let's say, an optimum price. We shifted that towards a price discovery, which is kind of 3 quotes, then putting out a price guide, and then going out on a proposal to 5 suppliers and getting them all to try and beat that price guide. Just that simple approach, we saved 30 to 40% of the cost of a food parcel. Now, of course, because we spend every cent we have on food, that means instead of buying 6,000 food parcels, we can buy something like 8,000 food parcels. You know, so in practical terms for everyone on the call, so we would have a 465 Rand parcel that now we could buy for about 330 Rand. Now, the reason I bring this in is also the cost of those items. You simply can't buy it at that cost at a spaza shop. You know, so that 330 Rand, because of the bulk purchasing, goes a hell of a lot further. Also, there's no logistics costs because I guess at this point in the time, the corporates are donating warehousing and logistics, and delivery is, you know, directly to the doorstep, so to speak. And I know that's not practical. Having said that, our solution won't scale to serve 10 million people, you know, and different solutions have come in to say. And I know that a big argument has been that when we do this, it cuts the spaza shops out of the food chain, or out of the value chain, so to speak, and it then leaves the spaza shop owners kind of hungry, you know. And I think we've got to begin to decide which problem it is that we're fixing. And I think the cash vouchers, which we have supported as a committee as well, worked really well, particularly in outlying areas. But what we would like to see in the food vouchers is that there's a personal accreditation that this is the person that needs it. Whereas when we're delivering the food parcels, there's a human interaction before the food parcel is handed over, which verifies the need, so to speak. When it gets a bit digital, it gets a bit impersonal. Now, I'm not saying that it's not working. I'm just saying we need to build around the food voucher system a little bit as well. And, you know, some of the more interesting food voucher systems I've seen link to the confirmation that the money can only be spent on food products, you know. And I think that's another necessary check in the digital system that needs to come in. You don't necessarily want the money being spent on airtime or alcohol or anything else for that matter. And your last point on soup kitchens, we are beginning to look at supporting a soup kitchen. And I think where the soup kitchens are really useful is where the digital voucher and the food hamper fails. And that is the digital voucher and the food hamper can't deal with the excess agricultural production at the moment, or the production that's not being consumed in takeouts, you know, to be frank. And so, you know, under the guidance of our committee, we're exploring how we could partner with other organizations to secure that supply, but then it needs to be cooked. It's a perishable. It needs to be cooked, you know. And maybe the last comment that I'd like to just add in here is just the regulatory one, which I think I should have really mentioned in my introduction, is whilst government is our partner, sometimes it's a bit of an obstacle. And there's been a whole lot of guidelines around food distribution of hot meals. And that adds a degree of complexity into hot meals that is quite logistically onerous. And we welcome that soup kitchens can address the agricultural issue, but then we need the health and safety issues around it to be addressed at the same time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Suveer. I noticed that there are a couple of other questions, and one of them directed particularly at you, and that is, how do we get access to this bulk purchasing pricing for local on-the-ground groups like local Rotary Club chapters? I think that Henrietta was earlier talking about how just grouping together to buy in bulk in her community has helped somewhat. It doesn't reach the kind of scale that your initiative does, but I wonder if you have a quick response to that, Suveer.
Well, through you, they're happy to get in touch with me, and I'll make our pricing easily available. Yeah.
Thank you so much. There are still questions that are left hanging around food making its way into the hands of foreign nationals who are particularly desperate, and to refugee camps in other parts of Africa. But I think, Tatjana, coming to you for your concluding remarks, I have also seen in the chat that there is an appetite for spaces to engage in these kind of conversations more. And so the question really is, what are the conversations we're not having? What are the conversations we should be having? Who's not coming to the table that should be? I wonder if you'd like to maybe think about that and anything else that has come up in the last little while.
Thanks, Chandre. And maybe if I can just pick up just one additional dimension on the role of soup kitchens. Many of these soup kitchens were pre-existing. They were efforts supported by local churches or women's cooperatives. And we've seen in places and spaces where, and I think Henrietta and Nhlanhla are both very good examples of where there was capacity, already active individuals in communities, there has been a greater resilience in those spaces. And I think these soup kitchens are being strengthened in this process. I know that some of the money donated is actually going to buying better setup appliances for those soup kitchens. And also we were talking about in our chat room how many of these parcels include maize or dried beans, things that require clean water, you know, the beans to soak overnight, and a substantial price in the energy required to cook those. So you've got to have all sorts of things in your home and in your setup and in your financial status in order to manage even some of those food parcels. So certainly those food kitchens play an important role and strengthen our ability to continue to respond to food needs going forward. Who's not in these conversations? Well, I think you said it yourself, Chandre, at the beginning. There's a new social awareness coming up. There's a new social listening that's happening. I think more voices are in these conversations in a more democratic way than ever before. So what's important actually is how do we, particularly as civil society, how do we, to use some of the Rios terminology, how do we engage in these stretch collaborations? How do we think about new ways of listening and participating that don't require adapting or consensus building, but strategies that result in innovation and structures in which we can operate where the market is acceptable, government voices are acceptable, and that those mechanisms, so C19 has started a system for engagement. The National Food Forum crisis coming out of, or National Food Crisis Forum coming out of SAFC is another one. And there's a few others. I think the important thing is how do we come together as civil society to talk to one another in a constructive way and bring in these other voices so that we create structures, mechanisms for coordinated policy making and action in the food system going forward. And that's that last piece of formalizing that in a way that makes sense to everybody is still a gap.
Thank you so much, Tatjana. I think we have an opportunity, just if any of the speakers would like to have one final word before we wrap up, I'm happy to make the floor open to you. Nhlanhla?
For me, I would like to respond on the foreign nationals with the support that they are not getting. I have just on my own made it a point that I identify the places where they are. Yesterday, I identified a group of more than 150, and I've been taking from the vegetable parcels and some of the donated food parcels to go and give it to them. And that's basically what I'm doing. And I'm also coordinating with other organizations that we are working with. We as Umgibe Stop Hidden Hunger and Gifted Hope, we are sending more parcels tomorrow there. And all I can say here is that as we are here, we can each contribute towards that, because we cannot be able to say we've got Ubuntu if we cannot feed our own people. It's about humanity. It's not about anything else. So on closing, I would just say that let us get together, let us work with whatever way we can and make this possible, because there is hunger out there. The issue is hunger. It has got no credit. It doesn't care whether you ate in the morning or you ate yesterday. It still wants something. I thank you.
Thank you, Nhlanhla. I'll just point you to a message in the chat function from one of our participants asking if there's a way to donate to support your continued support. So perhaps you want to respond to that. I noticed, Suveer, your speaker came on. Perhaps you'd like, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. Perhaps my final comments too that I'd like to make is also with regards to the foreign nationals or undocumented migrants. One of the biggest challenges that we have whilst delivering food parcels to them is or let's call it the paperwork engine around us requires us to have a name, a phone number, an address, and a signature. That scares them. Yeah. That really scares them. So I pray that somehow government can find a safe way to document the undocumented, whether it's a safe haven where you can come in and get some kind of reference number against your fingerprint, simply as that, to make life of these undocumented migrants safe, is necessary. Because when they're outside of the systems, they become complete victims, not just to the system, but to all forms of abuses at large. And then, of course, my beast that I'd like to take down is all of the paperwork. And sometimes, as much as I'm compliant and I want to show all of the donors out there that we are fully above board and completely compliant, in the middle of a humanitarian relief, there is simply no space for some of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suveer. Henrietta, I don't know if you'd like one final comment.
Yes, my final comment is in terms of just picking up what somebody said earlier on. We are so used to working in silos. There is a need for us to work together. I want to bring it to the attention of everybody that there is the People's Coalition, which is a national structure that has got lots of CBOs and NGOs, civil society organizations in it. There is a working group on basic needs. So if anybody wants to assist and help, Rosile is the working group convener. We kind of have all our organizations nationally. We have that's on the ground. We have our databases, and we're working on the ground. So if assistance needs to come to communities on the ground, I would suggest that I'm not sitting here as Henrietta from Bonteheuwel, but I'm sitting here as a representative of the poor and the vulnerable. The last comment I want to leave is that there is food insecurity. We're currently having issues with because of COVID-19, because of the import of food and so forth. There is a lack of food. The prices are going up. So we need to work together as soon as possible and not duplicate what each other is doing and not be in competition, because we also have that there's people in competition out there because whoever holds the food holds the power. So we need to break down those barriers and challenges and get food to our people as quickly as adequately and sufficiently as possible. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Henriette. And that just leaves it to me to thank you all very much for coming, and especially our speakers. Thank you very much. I'm most grateful to all of you for having given your time today. We really hope that this seminar is going to stimulate solutions and new connections, and maybe a better understanding of the issues as part of a broader conversation.